Rain hammered the razor wire above HMP Barlinnie as Callum Reid stepped through the main security gate for the first time. The prison rose from the darkness like a dying concrete fortress, its narrow windows glowing faintly against the Glasgow night. Every story he had heard during training suddenly felt real. Men disappeared in Barlinnie. Officers learned to stop asking questions. Some never made it home unchanged. Callum adjusted the stiff collar of his new uniform while an older guard beside him smoked silently beneath a flickering light. "You're the rookie?" the guard finally asked. Callum nodded. "First night shift." The man gave a tired grin. "Then keep your head down and your mouth shut." Inside the prison, the air smelled of bleach, damp walls, and sweat. Echoes traveled strangely through the corridors. Somewhere distant, metal slammed against metal. Prisoners shouted through cell doors using coded phrases Callum could not understand. Others simply stared as he walked past, their eyes cold and watchful through narrow observation slots. Cell Block D was worse than the others. The governor had described Barlinnie as difficult but controlled. Yet nothing inside Cell Block D felt controlled. The prisoners moved with the confidence of men who feared nothing, not even punishment. Tattoos crawled across their faces and necks. Some smiled at Callum in ways that made his stomach tighten. Near midnight, screams exploded from the upper landing. Callum ran toward the noise with two senior officers. An inmate lay cornered near the showers while three masked prisoners kicked him repeatedly in the ribs and face. Blood spread across the wet floor beneath him. "Jesus Christ," Callum muttered. He moved forward instinctively, but one of the older officers grabbed his shoulder. "Leave it. They'll kill him." The officer's expression never changed. "Not our problem yet." The assault continued for nearly another minute before the attackers disappeared calmly back into their cells. The injured inmate barely moved, coughing blood onto the concrete. Callum stared at the senior officers in disbelief. None of them called medical staff immediately. None looked shocked. It was routine to them. As the prisoner was dragged away, another inmate standing behind the bars whispered softly to Callum, "You saw nothing tonight." Callum turned, but the man stepped back into darkness before he could respond. Hours later, exhaustion crept into Callum's body. He walked alone through a lower corridor carrying paperwork towards solitary confinement. Most of the prison had fallen quiet, though distant banging still echoed through the pipes overhead. As he passed an unlit cell, a pale hand suddenly shot through the food hatch and grabbed his wrist. Callum froze. A prisoner's voice rasped from inside the darkness. "Take it." Something wet pressed into his palm before the hand vanished. Callum looked down. A folded scrap of paper stained with fresh blood rested in his shaking fingers. He unfolded it carefully. "They bury people alive in here." A violent crash echoed nearby before Callum could think further. Alarms erupted through the corridor. Officers shouted from the solitary wing ahead. Callum sprinted toward the noise alongside several guards. Inside the final isolation cell, a prisoner hung motionless from tied bedsheets attached to the ceiling vent. The dead man's face was swollen purple beneath the harsh fluorescent light. One officer cursed quietly while another ordered everyone back. Callum stared at the body, trying to slow his breathing. Then he noticed something strange. Dark bruises circled both of the prisoner's wrists. Fresh bruises. As though someone had held him down before he died. Behind him, one of the guards pulled the cell door closed and whispered to an officer, "Governor Bain will want this cleaned up before count." Callum heard the words, and prison felt colder. Morning fog hung over Barlinnie as whispers about the dead inmates spread through the prison like smoke. By the end of Callum Reid's second shift, nobody openly called it suicide anymore. Officers avoided eye contact whenever the incident was mentioned, and prisoners fell silent whenever guards approached their cells. Callum spent most of the morning replaying the bruises he had seen around the prisoner's wrists. They had not looked accidental. Someone had restrained the man before his death. Yet every official report already described the incident as self-inflicted. Just after noon, Callum was summoned to the administrative wing. Governor Malcolm Bain stood waiting beside a polished wooden desk, smiling warmly as Callum entered. Bain looked nothing like the brutal prison stories whispered through cell block D. His silver hair was neatly combed, his tailored suit spotless beneath the prison jacket draped over his shoulders. "Officer Reed," Bain said calmly, extending his hand. "Settling in well, I hope." Callum shook his hand carefully. "Doing my best, sir." Bain spoke with the confidence of a politician rather than a prison governor. Framed newspaper articles covered the office walls, praising his rehabilitation programs and public reform campaigns. "Barlinnie has a difficult reputation," Bain explained, "but we're building something better here. Discipline and dignity. That's how broken men change." Callum nodded politely, though the image of the hanging inmate lingered in his mind. Before dismissing him, Bain's smile faded slightly. "One piece of advice," he said quietly. "Don't let prisoners fill your head with fantasies. Manipulation is their strongest weapon." Outside the office, Callum noticed two officers speaking nervously near a stairwell. Their conversation stopped the second he approached, but he caught a single sentence before they walked away. They took him below the old wing. That evening, Callum supervised meal distribution beside an older guard named McVeigh. The prisoners seemed restless. Tension crawled through the corridors. Rival gangs exchanged threats through cell doors while officers pretended not to notice. One inmate remained completely silent. Frankie Doyle sat alone at the back of his cell, heavily tattooed arms crossed beneath dim light. Unlike the others, he watched Callum with unsettling calm. When Callum stopped outside his door, Frankie finally spoke. "You're new enough to still care." Callum frowned. "About what?" Frankie stepped closer to the bars. "About people dying." Before Callum could answer, Frankie lowered his voice further. "Don't trust uniforms in this place. Some of them are worse than us." A loud crash suddenly erupted farther down the corridor. Prisoners began shouting as rival gang members hurled boiling water through food hatches. Officers rushed forward swinging batons while alarms screamed overhead. The violence lasted nearly 20 minutes. Later that night, disturbed by Frankie's warning, Callum entered the prison security room to review surveillance footage from the solitary wing. He wanted proof of what happened before the prisoner died. The officer on duty glanced nervously at the monitor. "You won't find anything." "Why not?" The man hesitated. "The footage is gone." Callum stared at the empty archive folder on the screen. Every camera recording from the solitary corridor between midnight and 3 in the morning had been erased. Who deleted it? Callum demanded. The officer swallowed hard. "No idea." But his frightened expression suggested otherwise. Hours later, exhausted and unsettled, Callum finally returned to his apartment on the edge of Glasgow. Rain tapped softly against the windows as he climbed the stairwell toward his door. Then he froze. The apartment door stood slightly open. Callum slowly stepped inside, heart pounding. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing looked disturbed. Until he reached the kitchen. The blood-stained note from the dead prisoner sat neatly in the center of the table. Beneath it, someone had written 3 new words in black ink. "You ask too much." Somewhere beyond the apartment walls, footsteps echoed down the corridor before stopping directly outside his door. Callum reached slowly for the kitchen knife. Callum Reed stood motionless inside his apartment kitchen, gripping the knife so tightly his knuckles turned pale. The footsteps outside the door remained still for several seconds before slowly retreating down the corridor. He waited nearly a minute before forcing himself to open the door and look outside. Nobody was there. Only the dim hallway lights and distant rain against cracked windows. By morning, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He considered reporting the break-in but stopped himself. Deep down, he already knew it would go nowhere. Someone inside Barlinnie wanted him frightened, isolated, and uncertain of his own judgment. The prison chapel became the only quiet place left inside the building. Soft candlelight flickered across worn wooden benches while distant prison noise echoed faintly through stone walls. Sister Elaine stood near the altar speaking gently with a trembling inmate whose face carried fresh bruises beneath one eye. Unlike most staff, she listened instead of commanding. Callum watched silently until the inmate left. "You look worse than the prisoners," Elaine said softly. Her calm voice caught him off guard. She appeared younger than he expected for a prison chaplain, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. There was kindness in her expression, but also caution. "Long night," Callum muttered. Elaine studied him carefully. "Barlinnie does that quickly." Over the following days, Callum found excuses to return to the chapel. Sometimes Elaine offered tea while prisoners drifted quietly in and out for counseling sessions. Other times she simply sat beside him in silence while rain battered the narrow stained-glass windows. Slowly, Callum began speaking about the hanging inmate, the missing surveillance footage, and the note left inside his apartment. Elaine listened without interrupting. Finally, she sighed heavily. "You're not the first officer who's noticed things." Callum looked at her sharply. "What does that mean?" She hesitated before reaching into a locked cabinet beside her desk. Inside sat several small notebooks filled with handwritten testimonies. "Prisoners talk to chaplains because they think we can't hurt them," she explained quietly. "Assaults, disappearances, threats. Some claim officers use the older prison wings for punishments that never appear in reports." Callum felt cold again. "Why not take this to the police?" Elaine gave a bitter smile. "You assume nobody already tried." That evening, Callum encountered Frankie Doyle again during recreation hour. The hardened inmate sat alone at a metal table while chaos unfolded nearby between rival gang members. Frankie motioned for Callum to approach. "You've started asking dangerous questions," he said calmly. Callum folded his arms. "You know something." Frankie's eyes shifted briefly toward nearby officers. "There's a group inside Barlinnie called the Velvet Circle. Guards, inmates, outside criminals. Everyone owns secrets on everyone else." "What kind of secrets?" "Blackmail, beatings, drugs, missing prisoners." Frankie leaned closer. "You embarrass the circle, you disappear." Before Callum could press further, officers dragged a terrified young inmate through the corridor nearby. The prisoner's name was Jamie Fry, barely 20 years old, thin and pale beneath oversized prison clothes. Jamie shouted desperately toward Elaine, who stood near the chapel doors. "I told them everything," he cried. "You promised they couldn't touch me." One officer slammed Jamie against the wall hard enough to silence him. The corridor fell deathly quiet. Later that night, Jamie Fry vanished. Records claimed he had been transferred to another facility, yet nobody could confirm where. Elaine spent hours calling administrative offices without answers while Callum searched empty holding cells throughout the older prison wing. Frankie Doyle only shook his head grimly when asked. "Told you," he muttered. "People vanish here." Near midnight, Elaine returned alone to the chapel office. Rain thundered against the roof as she unlocked her desk drawer. Inside rested a small cassette tape wrapped in brown paper. No name. No explanation. Only a handwritten sentence across the front. "Listen to the walls below." Hands trembling slightly, Elaine inserted the tape into an old recorder beside her desk. Static crackled first. Then came screaming. Human screaming. Distant, tortured, echoing from somewhere deep beneath Barlinnie Prison. The screams on the cassette haunted Callum Reid for days. Even when the prison corridors fell silent at night, he still heard them echoing in his head. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined unseen prisoners trapped beneath Barlinnie's concrete foundations, clawing at walls no one else could hear. Sister Elaine kept the cassette hidden inside the chapel office, wrapped beneath stacks of prayer books. Neither of them dared report it officially. Trust inside the prison had become poisonous. 3 nights later, Elaine led Callum toward a locked maintenance corridor beneath the oldest prison wing. "You're sure about this?" Callum whispered. Elaine produced a stolen key from her coat pocket. A former inmate drew maps before he died. He believed the tunnels connected to old punishment cells abandoned decades ago. The metal door groaned open. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. Their footsteps echoed through narrow underground tunnels lined with cracked pipes and rusted wiring. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Sections of the walls had been crudely sealed with newer concrete, though deep scratches remained visible beneath the repairs. Callum's flashlight landed on old restraint hooks bolted into the walls. What the hell happened down here? Elaine's face tightened grimly. Officially, Storage rooms. Farther inside, they discovered a rusted steel door hanging partially open. The chamber beyond was tiny, barely large enough for a man to stand upright. Stains darkened the floor beneath an ancient drain. Callum noticed scratch marks carved deeply into the concrete wall. Days. Names. Prayers. One message stood out among the others. They never let us leave. Suddenly, distant footsteps echoed somewhere above them. Elaine quickly shut off the flashlight. Both stood frozen in darkness until the sound disappeared. Back upstairs, Callum struggled to steady his breathing. His chest tightened painfully. Sweat covered his neck despite the freezing air. "You okay?" Elaine asked carefully. Callum nodded too quickly. "Fine." But he wasn't. The panic attacks had started quietly after the hanging inmate's death. Now they came without warning. Sudden dizziness. Trembling hands. The feeling someone stood behind him even when corridors were empty. He stopped sleeping entirely. Meanwhile, Frankie Doyle watched prison life unfold with bitter amusement from his cell. One evening during lockdown, he finally revealed fragments of his past. "I used to run collections for Glasgow gangs," Frankie muttered while staring through the bars. "Debt work. Intimidation. Whatever paid." Callum listened silently. Frankie laughed darkly. "Thought I was untouchable too. Then one deal went wrong. My own crew handed me over to police before I could speak." "Why?" "Because I knew where bodies were buried." Frankie's smile faded. Barlinnie wasn't punishment. It was insurance. Before Callum could respond, alarms exploded across cell block D. Prisoners surged through the corridors screaming as rival gangs attacked each other with sharpened toothbrushes and broken metal trays. Officers stormed forward swinging batons while smoke filled the upper landing. In the chaos, Callum spotted 3 guards dragging a handcuffed inmate into a side corridor away from security cameras. Then they simply stepped back. Half a dozen masked prisoners descended on the man instantly. The beating was savage. Boots slammed into ribs and skull while the inmate screamed for mercy. Blood sprayed across the walls. Callum moved instinctively toward them, but Officer McVeigh grabbed him violently. "Leave it." McVeigh barked. "They'll kill him." McVeigh stared coldly at the assault. "That's the point." Hours later, shaken and exhausted, Callum returned alone to the underground maintenance corridor searching for answers. Hidden behind loose concrete near the abandoned chamber, he discovered a small metal box coated in dust. Inside rested an old leather ledger. His pulse quickened as he opened it. Page after page listed inmate names, prison numbers, and dates entering solitary confinement. But beside dozens of names, no release dates existed. Only black marks. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence had been written carefully in red ink. "No one escapes the below cells." The red sentence inside the ledger stayed burned into Callum Reed's mind long after he hid the book beneath loose floorboards inside his apartment. Every missing inmate listed inside it had entered solitary confinement and seemingly vanished without explanation. No transfers. No releases. No deaths officially recorded. Just silence. The following evening, Sister Elaine arrived at the chapel looking pale and unsettled. She locked the office door before speaking. "Someone contacted me from outside the prison," she whispered. "Former inmate. He says his brother disappeared inside Barlinnie years ago." Callum immediately thought of the ledger. "What's his name?" "Lewis Kerr." Elaine explained that Lewis had spent nearly 6 years imprisoned for armed robbery before his release. During that time, his younger brother Aaron Kerr entered Barlinnie on drug charges and vanished less than 3 months later. Officials claimed Aaron committed suicide during a transfer between prison wings, but no body was ever returned to the family. "They buried the records," Elaine said quietly. "Lewis thinks Aaron was murdered." Late that night, Elaine arranged a secret phone call between Callum and Lewis using the chapel office line. Lewis sounded exhausted and constantly distracted, as though afraid someone might overhear him. "You found something down there, didn't you?" Lewis asked immediately. Callum hesitated. "Why would you say that?" "Because the old tunnels are real." Lewis lowered his voice further. I saw prisoners taken underground all the time. Some came back broken. Some never came back at all. Callum exchanged a tense glance with Elaine. Lewis continued. There were torture cells beneath the old wing. Officers used them for punishment when inmates caused trouble. But that wasn't the worst part. What do you mean? They turned prisoners into entertainment. The line crackled softly. Lewis explained how corrupt guards secretly organized brutal inmate fights deep beneath the prison, forcing vulnerable prisoners to battle violent offenders while officers gambled on the outcomes. Some inmates died from injuries later disguised as overdoses or suicides. Callum felt sick listening. Why didn't anyone expose it? Lewis laughed bitterly. Because the people involved weren't just guards. Lawyers, gangsters, prison staff. Everybody protected everybody. Before hanging up, Lewis agreed to meet Callum in person the following night near Glasgow Cathedral. You deserve the full truth, he warned. But once you hear it, there's no going back. The next morning, Callum confronted Frankie Doyle during exercise hour. You knew about the underground fights. Frankie stayed silent for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. I helped cover up one of the deaths. Callum stared at him in disbelief. Frankie leaned against the fence, eyes hollow with regret. There was a prisoner named Connor Wills. Young lad. Could barely defend himself. Officers threw him into a fight against some psychopath twice his size while men upstairs placed bets. Frankie swallowed hard. Connor died 3 days later in solitary. And you helped them hide it. I helped move the body. Frankie's voice cracked slightly. They promised protection if I kept quiet. Callum suddenly understood the deeper horror of Barlinnie. Corruption inside the prison was no longer isolated cruelty. It was systematic. Organised. Protected. The honest officers either looked away or slowly became part of it themselves. That realization shattered something inside him. Even Officer McVeigh, brutal as he seemed, now looked less like a monster and more like a man surviving inside a system built on fear. By evening, heavy rain covered Glasgow streets as Callum drove toward the cathedral for the meeting with Lewis Kerr. He checked his phone repeatedly, but Lewis never answered. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, Elaine called. Callum, she said breathlessly. Turn on the radio. Static crackled before the news bulletin interrupted. Police had discovered a burned vehicle near the River Clyde. Witnesses reported hearing an explosion shortly after midnight. The vehicle belonged to Lewis Kerr. Callum's stomach dropped. No body's been found yet, Elaine added quietly. But deep down, both of them already understood what it meant. Lewis Kerr had disappeared only hours before exposing the truth about Barlinnie Prison. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered city, someone was still cleaning up loose ends. Rainstorms swallowed Glasgow for nearly a week after Lewis Kerr vanished. News reports described the burned car near the River Clyde as a likely gang-related incident, but inside Barlinnie Prison, the atmosphere grew darker and far more dangerous. Callum Reid felt it immediately. Conversations stopped whenever he entered staff rooms. Officers who once joked with him now avoided eye contact entirely. Someone had spread rumors that he was secretly leaking prison information to journalists investigating corruption claims. One morning, Callum found the word rat scratched across his locker in black marker. Officer McVeigh stood nearby smoking silently. You should stop asking questions, McVeigh muttered without looking at him. Callum slammed the locker shut. You think I'm leaking information? I think people upstairs are nervous. McVeigh finally glanced toward him. Nervous people become violent. Later that afternoon, Governor Malcolm Bain appeared on local television inside the prison administration hall. Cameras captured him shaking hands with community officials while speaking calmly about rehabilitation and public safety. Barlinnie faces challenges, Bain announced smoothly, but recent violence stems from unstable inmates resisting reform efforts. Callum watched from the corridor in disbelief. Everything Bain said sounded rehearsed. Controlled. Clean. Meanwhile, prisoners continued disappearing into the older prison wings. That same evening, Elaine secretly showed Callum several inmate counseling records hidden inside the chapel office. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. "These men didn't simply become suicidal," she whispered. The files described vulnerable prisoners subjected to weeks of isolation, sleep deprivation, intimidation, and psychological manipulation. Some were threatened with attacks against family members outside prison. Others were convinced nobody would believe their accusations against officers. Several eventually harmed themselves. Others supposedly committed suicide before scheduled testimony hearings. Callum stared at one photograph showing bruises around an inmate's wrists identical to those on the first dead prisoner. "They pushed them until they broke," he muttered. Elaine nodded grimly. "And then they buried the evidence." Elsewhere inside cell block D, Frankie Doyle sat alone during lockdown when two senior officers quietly entered his cell. Neither wore body cameras. One placed a cigarette packet beside Frankie while the other leaned calmly against the wall. "You've been cooperative for years," the older officer said. "That can still benefit you." Frankie said nothing. The officer lowered his voice further. "Governor Bain is willing to discuss early release." Frankie finally looked up. "What's the price?" The answer came instantly. "Callum Reid." Silence filled the cell. "You don't need to kill him directly," the officer continued. "Just leave certain doors unlocked during next week's transfer rotation. Accidents happen constantly in Barlinnie." Frankie's jaw tightened as the officers walked away. For the first time in years, genuine fear entered his eyes. That night, Callum struggled to stay focused during solitary wing patrol. Lack of sleep had hollowed him out completely. His hands shook constantly now. Every shadow looked human. Every distant noise felt threatening. Near midnight, alarms suddenly erupted across the lower prison corridors. Officers sprinted past shouting conflicting orders while prisoners screamed behind locked doors. Callum followed the chaos toward the old maintenance wing before someone grabbed him violently from behind. Then darkness. Fragments returned slowly afterward. Concrete walls. Someone yelling. Blood splashing across his sleeves. A door slamming shut underground. Callum woke hours later beneath harsh infirmary lights. Pain pounded through his skull. For several seconds he could not remember where he was. Then he looked down. His hands were covered in dried blood. Not small stains. Soaked blood. Panic surged through him as he stumbled upright. A nurse rushed forward, trying to calm him, but Callum barely heard her. "What happened?" he demanded. Nobody answered immediately. Outside the infirmary room, two officers watched him silently through the glass while whispering to each other. And somewhere deep in Callum's fractured memory, he could still hear screaming beneath the prison floor. The screams inside Callum Reid's fractured memory refused to disappear. For 2 days after waking in the infirmary, nobody clearly explained how he ended up unconscious near the old maintenance wing. Officers claimed he suffered a panic attack during a prisoner disturbance. Yet their rehearsed expressions told him they were hiding something. Even worse, no one would explain the blood covering his hands. Callum returned to duty exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly uncertain of his own sanity. Every corridor inside Barlinnie now felt hostile. Prisoners watched him carefully through cell doors while officers whispered behind his back. Then the prison lights died. The entire building plunged into darkness just after evening count. For several seconds, silence consumed the prison. Then chaos erupted. Sirens failed. Emergency generators sputtered weakly before cutting out again. Cell doors malfunctioned across multiple wings, allowing prisoners to flood into corridors screaming and fighting. Rival gangs armed themselves with broken pipes and sharpened metal pulled from maintenance carts. "Control room's gone dark," an officer shouted somewhere nearby. Callum ran through smoke-filled corridors illuminated only by flickering emergency lights. Terrified officers barricaded themselves inside secure stations while prisoners seized entire sections of cell block D. Somewhere overhead, glass shattered violently. A prisoner sprinted past covered in blood before disappearing into darkness. Near the chapel corridor, Callum found Elaine helping injured inmates hide from the violence. Her face looked pale beneath the red emergency lighting. "This wasn't an accident," she said urgently. "Somebody triggered the blackout deliberately." Before Callum could respond, Elaine pulled several folded documents from beneath her coat. "I found these inside Bain's private office." The papers contained letters between Governor Malcolm Bain and multiple government officials discussing the growing risk of a national inquiry into historic abuse allegations at Barlinnie. One sentence stood out immediately: "Contain exposure before parliamentary review begins." Callum felt cold reading it. "They knew," he whispered. Elaine nodded grimly. "And they're terrified the inquiry will expose everyone connected to this prison." Suddenly, gunfire echoed from the upper wing. Prisoners began screaming louder. Callum and Elaine hurried through an emergency stairwell leading toward Blackout Wing, one of the oldest and rarely used prison sections. The deeper they moved underground, the colder the air became. Then Callum noticed something strange. Behind a rusted maintenance gate hidden beneath hanging electrical cables, a narrow concrete staircase descended even farther below the prison foundations. Elaine stared at it uneasily. This wasn't on any map. Using flashlights, they descended slowly into darkness. The underground chambers beneath Blackout Wing looked ancient. Rows of hidden cells stretched along narrow corridors barely tall enough to stand inside. Rusted restraints hung from the walls beside cracked drains in the floor. Some cell doors still carried faded numbers. Inside one chamber, Callum found deep claw marks carved into concrete. Another contained rotting leather straps attached to a metal chair bolted permanently to the floor. "They tortured people here," Elaine whispered. Before Callum could answer, distant footsteps echoed nearby. They shut off their flashlights instantly. Several officers moved through the tunnel above them carrying batons and flashlights. One voice spoke quietly through static-filled radio interference. "Search every lower chamber. Bain wants Reed found now." Callum's pulse quickened. They were hunting him. As the officers moved closer, Frankie Doyle suddenly appeared from a side corridor. Blood stained one side of his prison uniform. "This way," Frankie hissed. Callum hesitated only briefly before following him through another narrow tunnel passage. Frankie led them toward a locked utility door hidden behind broken piping. "You're helping us?" Callum asked breathlessly. Frankie avoided eye contact. "Doesn't mean I trust you." The sounds of searching officers grew louder behind them. Frankie finally stopped near an abandoned chamber at the tunnel's end. "Stay quiet," he warned. Moments later, several officers stormed into the corridor outside. One flashlight beam swept across the room. Then someone shouted in horror. Callum slowly stepped closer to the doorway and looked inside. A mutilated corpse hung chained against the wall beneath layers of dried blood and rusted restraints. The body wore a decayed prison officer's uniform. And judging by the condition of the remains, it had been hidden beneath Barlinnie for years. The discovery of the mutilated prison officer beneath Blackout Wing sent shockwaves through Barlinnie. By morning, entire underground sections were sealed off while Governor Malcolm Bain publicly dismissed the remains as historic misconduct unrelated to current operations. Nobody inside the prison believed him. Callum Reed barely slept after the blackout. Every time exhaustion dragged him under, he saw the chained corpse staring back through darkness. Worse still, fragments of missing memory continued returning in violent flashes. Blood on concrete. A prisoner screaming his name. His own hands shaking uncontrollably beneath underground lights. He no longer trusted himself. Meanwhile, Frankie Doyle remained under heavy guard after secretly helping Callum and Elaine escape the tunnels. Rumors spread quickly through Cell Block D that Frankie had betrayed powerful people inside the prison. That afternoon, Elaine unlocked the chapel confession room and quietly brought Callum inside. Hidden beneath floorboards rested dozens of cassette tapes collected over several years. "Prisoners trusted me because they thought confession protected them," Elaine whispered. She inserted one tape into an old recorder. A terrified inmate's voice filled the room. "They moved us below after lights out. No cameras. No records. If somebody complained about officers, they disappeared into the punishment units." Another tape followed. Then another. Prisoners described secret underground cells where beatings, torture, and psychological abuse continued for decades beneath official prison oversight. Some inmates returned broken beyond recognition. Others vanished entirely. One confession mentioned Governor Bain directly. He approved transfers himself. Said unstable prisoners needed isolation. Elaine's expression hardened. These recordings span 20 years. Callum sat silently, overwhelmed by the scale of corruption surrounding them. Bain was not simply protecting abusive officers anymore. He had built an entire hidden system designed to erase inconvenient prisoners. Late that evening, Callum confronted Frankie during isolated recreation hour. "You said people disappeared underground," Callum muttered. "Tell me everything." Frankie looked exhausted beneath bruised eyes. "There were unofficial punishment units beneath Blackout Wing," he admitted quietly. "Prisoners called them the below cells." Callum listened carefully. If inmates threatened exposure, officers transferred them down there after hours. Some got beaten until they stayed quiet. Others died. Frankie swallowed hard. The worst ones never came back at all. Who ran it? Frankie hesitated. Not just Bain. Politicians. Organized crime figures. Certain officers got rich protecting the system. Callum felt sick. "And you helped them?" Frankie's eyes darkened with shame. "I survived them." That answer lingered painfully in Callum's mind long afterward. By now, exhaustion had hollowed him out completely. He struggled separating paranoia from reality. Sometimes he caught himself staring suspiciously at innocent staff members. Other times he imagined footsteps following him through empty corridors. The prison was changing him. One stormy night, unable to sleep again, Callum returned to the chapel office searching for more tapes. Elaine sat alone beside candlelight reviewing inmate testimonies. "You need rest," she said softly. "So do you." For the first time in weeks, silence between them felt comforting instead of tense. Rain hammered the chapel windows while distant thunder shook the old prison walls. Elaine reached carefully for his trembling hand. "You're not becoming them," she whispered. Callum looked at her, emotionally exhausted beyond words. For several fragile seconds, the prison disappeared around them. Then Elaine kissed him. The moment felt dangerous. Wrong. Necessary. But reality crashed back quickly when alarms suddenly erupted across cell block D. Both rushed into the corridor alongside responding officers. Prisoners screamed from behind locked doors while guards forced back crowds gathering near Frankie Doyle's cell. Callum pushed through the chaos. Frankie lay collapsed on the floor inside his locked cell, blood spreading rapidly beneath him. A sharpened metal blade protruded from his stomach while deep stab wounds covered his chest and neck. "How?" Callum shouted. The cell was locked. Nobody answered. Frankie's terrified eyes found Callum through the bars as officers scrambled uselessly around him. He tried desperately to speak. Blood filled his mouth. Then his body went still only moments before investigators scheduled to arrive at Barlinnie could hear his testimony. Frankie Doyle's murder shattered the last illusion of control inside Barlinnie Prison. By sunrise, news of hidden torture cells, missing inmates, and decades of corruption leaked across Scotland. Anonymous recordings from Elaine's confession tapes reached journalists before prison officials could contain them. Television crews gathered outside Barlinnie's gates while furious protesters clashed with police across Glasgow streets. Inside the prison, violence exploded. Prison gangs used the chaos to settle old scores while inmates screamed accusations at officers through barricaded corridors. Several prison wings caught fire after mattresses were ignited during overnight riots. Smoke rolled through broken windows as emergency sirens echoed endlessly across the city. Former gang territories across Glasgow erupted as well. Old criminal networks once connected to Barlinnie turned against each other, terrified about what imprisoned members might reveal if national investigators uncovered decades of hidden crimes. Callum Reid watched the destruction unfold from an upper corridor blackened with smoke. Officers no longer trusted each other enough to patrol alone. Every conversation sounded nervous. Every movement felt desperate. Governor Malcolm Bain responded publicly with cold determination. "These allegations are exaggerated lies spread by violent criminals," he declared during a televised press conference outside the prison. But behind closed doors, Bain's panic became obvious. That evening, Callum overheard two senior officers discussing emergency orders near the administration wing. "Destroy anything connected to underground transfers," one whispered urgently. "And the witness files. Burn them." Callum realized Bain intended to erase every remaining trace of the below cells before investigators arrived. Late that night, Officer McVeigh secretly approached Callum inside a deserted stairwell. "You want the truth?" McVeigh muttered nervously. "Then stop pretending Bain controls this place alone." Before Callum could respond, McVeigh handed him a small storage drive. "Insurance," he said bitterly. Inside the drive, Callum discovered years of secretly recorded footage captured by senior officers spying on each other. Assaults, illegal prisoner transfers, torture sessions beneath Blackout Wing. Some recordings even showed officers threatening fellow staff members to ensure silence. Everybody had been collecting evidence against everybody else. Mutual fear kept the system alive. Meanwhile, Elaine prepared to meet investigative journalists willing to expose the scandal publicly before officials could bury it. Despite Callum's warnings, she insisted the evidence needed to leave Barlinnie immediately. "They're already killing witnesses," she argued. "If we wait longer, more people disappear." Rain hammered Glasgow streets as Elaine drove toward the arranged meeting point near the city centre. She never arrived. A speeding black vehicle slammed violently into her car at an isolated intersection, crushing the passenger side before disappearing into the storm. Elaine survived only because her vehicle spun into a barrier instead of oncoming traffic. At the hospital, bruised and shaken, she grabbed Callum's wrist tightly. "That wasn't random," she whispered painfully. "They knew where I was going." Callum stayed beside her until after midnight before finally returning alone to his apartment. Exhaustion dragged at him relentlessly now. The prison, the riots, the murders, it all felt larger than anything he could stop. Then his phone vibrated. Unknown sender. Attached was a single audio file. Callum hesitated before pressing play. Static crackled softly. Then a calm male voice spoke clearly through background prison noise. "Transfer the inmate below. If he resists, end it permanently." Callum froze instantly. The voice did not belong to Governor Bain. It belonged to someone older, more controlled, more powerful. At the file's end, another man addressed the speaker directly. "Yes, Minister." The audio file changed everything. Callum Reid listened to it over and over until the words stopped sounding real. "Yes, Minister." The phrase did not belong inside Barlinnie's corruption network alone. It pointed beyond it, into government corridors, into offices far above Governor Malcolm Bain's authority. For the first time, Callum understood the scale of what they had uncovered. It was not just a prison. It was a system. Within 48 hours, national investigators arrived at HMP Barlinnie, sealing off entire wings while forensic teams documented burned records, hidden tunnels, and evidence of long-term abuse. News helicopters circled overhead as Scotland erupted in outrage. Callum stood outside the main gates watching armed officers escort prisoners into temporary holding vehicles. Many inmates shouted accusations at staff being detained. Others simply stared blankly, as if finally seeing the end of something they had long stopped believing would ever change. Inside the prison administration building, chaos unfolded. Files were missing. Servers had been wiped. Entire sections of surveillance data had been destroyed during the blackout. But Elaine's recordings survived, backed up across multiple journalists and encrypted servers already circulating online. She had done it. Despite the attack on her, despite warnings, Elaine released everything. By morning, Scotland was in uproar. Politicians demanded resignations. Human rights organisations called for a full national inquiry. Former inmates came forward in increasing numbers, describing the same underground punishment system, the same below cells, the same disappearances. Callum watched the headline scroll endlessly across television screens in the temporary operations room set up near Barlinnie's entrance. Then Officer McVeigh entered, looking pale. "Bain's gone," he said flatly. Callum looked up sharply. "Gone." Disappeared overnight. Border alerts just went up. It was later confirmed. Governor Malcolm Bain had attempted to flee Scotland using falsified diplomatic clearance papers. His public statement claimed innocence, that he had merely followed orders from higher authorities within the justice system. But investigators were no longer interested in excuses. They were interested in names. That night, Elaine sat with Callum inside a secure interview room surrounded by investigators and journalists. Her injuries from the car crash had not fully healed, but her voice remained steady as she confirmed every detail from the recordings. This wasn't one man, she said firmly. This was decades of coordinated abuse. Her testimony triggered immediate arrests across multiple prison staff levels. Officers once considered untouchable were dragged out in handcuffs while cameras captured every moment. Yet something still felt unfinished. Callum could not escape the audio file. Yes, Minister. Whoever spoke those words had not been exposed. 3 days later, Bain was found dead in a sealed hotel room near the outskirts of Glasgow. Official reports claimed suicide. The media called it the final collapse of a disgraced governor. Callum attended the identification process in silence. But when he saw the body, something inside him tightened. It was not the death that disturbed him. It was the marks. Dark bruises circled Bain's wrists. Identical in shape and placement to the first dead inmate Callum had ever seen hanging inside solitary confinement. The same pressure points. The same restraint pattern. Callum stepped back slowly, heart pounding. "This doesn't end with Bain," he whispered. Outside the morgue, rain began falling heavily over Glasgow again. And somewhere deep inside the system they had just begun to expose, something, or someone, was still operating exactly as before. Months after Governor Bain's death, the investigation into HMP Barlinnie had officially been declared ongoing, though inside Glasgow it felt more like an open wound than a legal process. The prison still stood, but it no longer functioned as it once did. Entire wings were sealed, staff rotated under supervision, and most remaining officers worked under constant suspicion. Yet closure never came. Survivors of the system struggled in silence. Former inmates who had once been victims of underground punishment units now found themselves lost in a world that refused to fully believe them. Some spoke publicly, only to be dismissed as unreliable or unstable. Others simply disappeared back into obscurity, unable to relive what had been done to them beneath the prison. Callum Reid was no better. He no longer recognized himself in mirrors. Sleep brought only fragments, screams beneath concrete, flashing lights, the sensation of being dragged through unseen corridors. The investigation had exposed the truth, but truth had not brought peace. Instead, it had scattered guilt in every direction. Sometimes he wondered if exposing everything had made it worse. Because alongside the guilty, innocent people had been destroyed too. Officers who had only followed orders out of fear were arrested and publicly humiliated. Families of lower-ranking staff lost homes, jobs, reputations. Entire communities tied to Barlinnie's workforce collapsed under the weight of public outrage. Callum stopped answering most phone calls. He barely left his apartment. Sister Elaine, however, refused to stop searching. She spent her days cross-referencing erased prison logs, visiting government archives, and tracking families of inmates whose names had been wiped from official records. Many of these families had never received confirmation of death or transfer. Just silence. Just absence. One evening, she arrived at Callum's apartment holding a thick folder. "They're still missing," she said quietly. "Dozens of them. Maybe more." Callum stared at the papers. "We exposed everything." "No," Elaine replied. "We exposed what they allowed us to see." Her words lingered heavily in the room. That night, Callum reopened the encrypted storage drive Officer McVeigh had given him months earlier. Most files had already been analyzed by investigators, but one section had been overlooked, buried under corrupted data fragments and mislabeled archives. When he finally decrypted it, the screen displayed a list of names. Not prisoners. Not victims. Officials. Mid-level administrators. Correctional supervisors. External contractors. People who had never been arrested during the raids. People whose identities had quietly disappeared from public investigation reports after Bain's death. At the bottom of the file, a single metadata tag repeated itself. Active oversight structure. Continuity confirmed. Callum felt his stomach drop. "They're still inside the system," he whispered. Elaine read over his shoulder, her face draining of color. "This wasn't dismantled," she said slowly. "It was redistributed." Outside, Glasgow was quiet. Too quiet. The investigation had not ended corruption. It had only changed its shape. Days passed. Callum tried to convince himself it was paranoia returning, but small details began to disturb him again. A black car parked too long outside his building. Unknown numbers calling and hanging up. A prison file reappearing on his laptop despite being deleted. Elaine became more careful too, always checking behind her before entering buildings. Neither of them spoke about returning to Barlinnie, but the thought lingered between them like a shadow. Then the letter arrived. No return address. No postage stamp detail he recognized. Just a plain envelope slipped beneath his apartment door late at night. Callum opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence only. "The evil inside Barlinnie was never locked away." He read it again, feeling his breath tighten. For a moment, the apartment felt colder than he remembered it ever being. Then, a sound. Soft. Measured. Footsteps outside his door.